Marcus Aurelius, born in the year 121 after Christ, occupies a singular place in the history of humanity, not only as the Emperor of Rome, but also as one of the greatest exponents of Stoic philosophy. Few men bore the task of carrying an empire upon their shoulders, an empire that stretched across vast regions, encompassing peoples, cultures, religions, and armies, while at the same time preserving such a disciplined and reflective inner life. He ruled from 161 to 180 after Christ, a period marked by bloody wars, devastating epidemics, and political crises, but it was precisely under these circumstances that his Stoic thought flourished and became even more relevant. The contrast between the brutality of public life and the serenity of his personal reflections transformed Marcus Aurelius into a timeless icon, a ruler who, in the midst of chaos, sought order within the soul. From an early age, Marcus demonstrated an inclination toward philosophy and a life of moral discipline. Adopted by Antoninus Pius, who prepared him to succeed him, Marcus grew up in an environment of high ethical and political demands. Unlike other emperors who succumbed to luxury, vanity, and the abuses of power, he chose Stoic wisdom as the guiding principle of his life. This choice was not the product of naive idealism, but of practical necessity. In the face of inevitable suffering, court intrigues, and the weight of power, only a philosophy that emphasized self-control and acceptance of destiny could offer the stability he needed. Marcus Aurelius understood early on that ruling an empire required more than military strength. It required inner strength. His nickname, Philosopher Emperor, is not just a poetic title granted by posterity. He truly lived as a philosopher, writing daily for himself in his Meditations, a work never intended for the public, yet which became one of the most precious treasures of the philosophical tradition. This intimate diary reveals not a distant figure, but a human being aware of his own weaknesses and limitations, who honestly sought to apply Stoic principles to everyday life. Within those pages, there are no speeches meant to impress, only practical reminders about the brevity of life, the value of virtue, and the need to remain serene in the storms of existence. Throughout his reign, Marcus faced enormous challenges: internal rebellions, barbarian invasions, the devastating Antonine Plague that killed millions of people, and yet he managed to preserve a posture of discipline and serenity. His writings stand as testimony to a ruler who, even surrounded by blood and despair, sought to remain faithful to the idea that nothing external could corrupt the soul that remained steadfast in its virtue. His life was, therefore, a practical embodiment of what the Stoics preached, that true power lies not in mastering territories, but in mastering oneself. Another important aspect is the contrast between Marcus Aurelius and other emperors of his time or earlier. While many Roman rulers are remembered for tyranny or excess, Marcus stood out for his moderation, his pursuit of justice, and his constant effort to serve the common good. He did not see himself as a god, but as a man destined to fulfill a temporary function, a role in a cosmic theater far greater than himself. This awareness of smallness before the universe is what gives his figure such greatness. The most powerful ruler in the world knew that in the end, his life was brief, and his only mission was to live according to reason and virtue. The image of Marcus Aurelius sitting in his camp during the campaigns in the north of the empire, quietly writing his meditations while his generals prepared for battle, is a powerful symbol of the balance between action and reflection. He understood that the external world could collapse, that war was inevitable, that death lurked at every corner, and yet the mind could remain firm, like an impregnable fortress. This is the lesson that crosses the centuries and continues to inspire people in search of emotional balance and spiritual strength. For all these reasons, Marcus Aurelius should not be studied only as a Roman emperor, but as a guide to life. His thought transcended the limits of the empire, crossed the centuries, and today finds renewed strength in times of anxiety, information overload, and existential crises. He teaches us that greatness is not in conquering the world, but in conquering ourselves. It is this teaching that makes Marcus Aurelius not only a historical figure, but an eternal companion to all who seek wisdom, serenity, and inner discipline. To understand the depth of Marcus Aurelius's reflections, it is necessary to go back several centuries and analyze the philosophical ground that preceded him. Stoicism was born around 300 years before Christ, in Athens, with Zeno of Citium. who, after a shipwreck, found in philosophy the answer to the fragility and impermanence of life. Zeno began teaching in a public colonnade, the Stoa Poikil, and it was from this space that the school received its name, Stoicism. From the very beginning, its proposal was not merely speculative but practical, to teach men and women to live with firmness in the face of adversity, cultivating an unshakable mind, free from emotional disturbances, and aware of its role in the cosmos. The core of this philosophy can be summarized in a few central ideas that were transmitted across the centuries until reaching Marcus Aurelius. First, the notion that virtue is the only true good, and everything else, wealth, power, pleasure, pain, illness, death, belongs to the realm of indifference, things beyond our control, and therefore should not be the measure of our happiness. Second, the idea that the universe is governed by a rational order, the logos, which organizes all things. The wise man must live in harmony with this order, accepting fate with serenity. Third, the focus on self-control, the discipline of passions, so as not to become a slave to impulses, but a master of oneself. Over time, Stoic philosophy crossed borders and found fertile ground in Rome, where it came to shape the mentality of politicians, generals, and public men. Seneca, in the 1st century after Christ, was one of the most notable representatives of this tradition. Advisor to Emperor Nero, Seneca lived between luxury and tragedy, surrounded by intrigue, but in his letters and treatises, he consistently emphasized the importance of inner balance. For him, philosophy was not a theoretical exercise, but a guide for daily life. In writing about the brevity of life and the necessity of using time well, Seneca anticipated reflections that would echo in Marcus Aurelius. Both shared the awareness that life is short and uncertain, and that only the cultivation of virtue can make it complete. Another fundamental link in the Stoic chain was Epictetus, a former slave who also lived in the 1st century after Christ. His biography alone is a demonstration of the strength of Stoicism. Born in conditions of oppression, with a weakened body and no freedom, Epictetus taught that true freedom does not depend on external circumstances, but on the ability to master one's own thoughts and choices. He affirmed that some things are under our control, our opinions, our desires, our attitudes, and others are not. Wealth, status, health, fame, death. Wisdom lies in focusing only on what can be controlled. This principle was deeply absorbed by Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations, where he constantly reminded himself not to waste energy on what lay beyond his reach. Thus, when Marcus Aurelius writes his reflections, he is not inventing something new, but rather applying in a personal, honest, and practical way a tradition that had been refined for centuries. Zeno laid the foundations, Seneca adapted them to the political and social life of Rome, and Epictetus made them accessible even to those in the most adverse conditions. Marcus Aurelius, in turn, put this heritage into action on the battlefield, in the administration of the empire and in the solitude of his thoughts. He was the living example of how philosophy could guide not only ordinary individuals, but even the most powerful man on earth. This historical journey shows that Stoicism was not merely a set of ideas preserved in scrolls, but a living current of wisdom that survived shipwrecks, political conspiracies, slavery, and wars, arriving to Marcus Aurelius as a flame that refused to die out. It is this flame that continues to burn today, inspiring people who seek inner strength, serenity in the face of crises, and quiet discipline in a chaotic world. Among all the legacies of Marcus Aurelius, none compares to the work that has crossed the centuries with an almost sacred force: the Meditations. Unlike public speeches or philosophical texts designed for posterity, this book is an intimate notebook, a diary of self-instructions and personal reminders written over years, especially during his military campaigns against Germanic tribes in the north of the empire. There was no intention of persuading senators, impressing generals, or building a lasting reputation. These were words addressed to himself, reflections often written at night in cold camps, after bloody battles, or in moments of extreme fatigue. Precisely for this reason, these pages became one of the greatest witnesses of the inner struggle of a man who, while ruling the greatest empire in the world, also needed to rule himself. The Meditations do not follow a systematic order, as if they were a philosophical treatise. They are fragments, quick notes, phrases repeated at different times, as though Marcus were trying to engrave the same principles into his mind, day after day. Among these principles stand out the focus on controlling passions, the acceptance of life's brevity, the constant remembrance of death, humility in the face of the vastness of the cosmos, and the conviction that only virtue can make a man truly good. This fragmented structure reveals the practical character of the work. It is not a text meant to be studied in academic silence, but a manual of spiritual survival amid chaos. When reading the Meditations, one can imagine Marcus Aurelius sitting alone, writing so as not to lose himself. He reminds himself not to fear tomorrow, for destiny cannot be avoided, not to grow angry at the malice of others, for all are guided by their own limitations, not to cling to external things, for they belong to the inevitable flow of time. In several passages, he writes as though he were a master teaching a disciple, but the disciple is himself, the emperor striving to remain human, rational, and just in the face of overwhelming circumstances. This intimate diary is also a portrait of vulnerability. We often imagine emperors as unshakable figures, but Marcus Aurelius demonstrates that even the most powerful man can be plagued by doubts, sadness, and fears. His greatness lies not in feeling nothing, but in choosing how to respond. He admits his faults, acknowledges his tendency toward anger or laziness, and writes precisely to correct himself. This radical honesty is what makes the Meditations so universal. In them, any reader can recognize themselves, whether a soldier, a modern worker, or someone seeking emotional balance. Another remarkable aspect is that Marcus Aurelius does not get lost in abstractions. He does not write about ideal worlds, but about everyday life. He speaks of waking up early, facing difficult people, resisting the temptation of hatred, controlling one's own tongue, accepting the loss of loved ones. He teaches that we cannot change the external world, but we can change our attitude toward it. It is an applied, direct philosophy, made to be used in every gesture, in every breath. This practicality is what makes the Meditations one of the most widely read and admired books even today, not only by philosophers, but by leaders, artists, athletes, and anyone in need of strength to go on. The presence of death as a recurring theme is another striking point. Marcus reminds himself that soon he will no longer exist, just as all the great men who preceded him are gone. He cites emperors, generals, thinkers, and repeats that they are all gone, and that the same destiny awaits him. This awareness of transience does not lead him to despair, but to an urgency for virtue. If life is brief, then it must be lived with justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom. If time is limited, it must not be wasted on vanity or resentment. At its core, the Meditations show a man at war with himself. The battle Marcus Aurelius fought against invading tribes was only a reflection of his inner struggle against anger, vanity, sadness, and human weakness. By writing, he raised a spiritual fortress capable of withstanding what the external world could not prevent: pain, loss, betrayal, illness, and death. This work is not merely a testimony of his philosophy, but a mirror of his soul. And it is precisely for this reason that it remains alive, because it shows that even an emperor must remind himself every single day how to be human. Among the most solid pillars of Stoicism that Marcus Aurelius incorporated into his reflections is the conviction that true power does not lie in kingdoms, armies, or wealth, but in what a man keeps within himself, his mind. For the Stoics, nothing that comes from outside can define the essence of an individual, for everything external is transient, unstable, and subject to chance. Authentic power, the one that no one can take away, resides in inner mastery, in the capacity not to be shaken by circumstances beyond human control. Marcus Aurelius repeated to himself that the world could strip him of his health, his friends, his position, and even his life, but it could never take away his decision to live according to reason and virtue. This notion of inner fortress was not an abstraction for the emperor, but a practical necessity. He faced at the same time the weight of the crown and the fragility of being human. Surrounded by continuous wars on the frontiers of the empire and by the devastation of the Antonine Plague, Marcus was daily exposed to instability, fear, and collective suffering. Yet amid this landscape of destruction, he found in the control of his own mind the only place of true safety. In his Meditations, there are passages in which he states that events themselves have no power over man, but rather it is the interpretation we give to them that determines our pain or serenity. This perception reveals the core of inner power. We cannot command the world, but we can command our response to it. When thinking about inner power, Marcus Aurelius was not advocating cold indifference or insensitivity. On the contrary, he acknowledged that emotions, pains, and desires arise naturally. The essential point was not to become a slave to these impulses. An emperor who could govern an empire but could not govern himself would be an unstable tyrant, vulnerable to passions and pride. Marcus sought to be the opposite of that. He saw himself as a guardian of order, but before protecting the empire, he needed to protect his soul from inner corruption. This constant vigilance, which appears in his notes, shows the daily struggle to preserve the mind as a citadel, impenetrable to external influences. Inner power also manifests itself in the awareness of the transience of things. Marcus Aurelius knew that the glory of Rome, no matter how imposing, was not eternal. Palaces, temples, armies, and even emperors would pass away. This vision led him to perceive that placing one's happiness in external goods was a trap. Only that which remains intact in the face of the passage of time deserves trust, virtue, character, disciplined reason. That is why he insisted on keeping his mind centered, reminding himself that nothing could truly harm him as long as he remained faithful to his conscience. The lesson of inner power crosses the centuries because it touches directly on the fragility of the human condition. Today, as in the time of Marcus Aurelius, we live surrounded by uncertainties, crises, losses, and social pressures. Many place their peace in material goods, status, or unstable relationships, and when these external pillars collapse, their tranquility collapses with them. Marcus's teaching is that true strength must be built within each person, in a place where nothing external can penetrate without permission. This fortress does not eliminate pain, but prevents it from becoming despair. It does not eliminate injustice, but prevents it from destroying the serenity of the soul. The Philosopher Emperor understood, therefore, that the greatest of kingdoms was the invisible one, erected in the mind and sustained by the discipline of reason. It is in this inner space that man becomes invincible, not because he can control everything, but because he learns not to be controlled by what does not depend on him. Marcus Aurelius, in insisting on this point, left us one of the greatest legacies of Stoic thought, the certainty that every human being, regardless of position, wealth, or power, carries within himself the possibility of being unshakable. The true empire is the one we build in silence, within the soul itself. One of the most insistent points in Marcus Aurelius's meditations is the need to control the passions, not allowing the mind to become a slave to anger, sadness, envy, or vanity. For him, true freedom did not lie in conquering territories, but in conquering oneself. Passions, when left untamed, turn into invisible chains that imprison man. An emperor capable of commanding legions but incapable of controlling his impulses would be nothing more than a servant to his own emotions. Marcus knew that every outburst of rage, every moment of despair, or every surrender to pride weakened his serenity and pulled him away from reason, which was the supreme guide of Stoic life. Emotional control did not mean for him the absence of feelings. Stoicism does not preach absolute coldness or mechanical insensitivity. Marcus Aurelius acknowledged that emotions arise naturally: sadness at loss, anger at injustice, fear in the face of danger. The essential point was not to be dominated by these forces, but to manage them with discipline, as a general manages his troops. The mind had to remain firm like a fortress, allowing feelings to pass through but never handing them the command. When writing about the irritation caused by difficult people, Marcus reminded himself that everyone has limitations and that it would be irrational to demand perfection from others, just as it would be irrational to expect a world free of pain. This posture had practical implications in his life as a ruler. Surrounded by political betrayals, ambitious generals, and revolting citizens, he understood that reacting with outbursts of wrath could lead to the ruin of the empire. He needed to maintain balance in the midst of chaos, not allowing external pressures to strip him of the clarity of reason. In his meditations, there are passages where he exhorts himself to endure the insolence of others, injustice, and even ingratitude, reminding himself that fate placed such people in his path precisely so he could exercise patience and virtue. Thus, Emotional control became constant training, a silent discipline that reinforced his inner greatness. The control of anger was perhaps one of the most visible struggles in his reflections. He knew that anger is a fire that consumes first the one who feels it. Instead of allowing that fire to destroy his peace, Marcus sought to extinguish it with reminders of the brevity of life and the smallness of offenses in the face of eternity. The insult of a man, however offensive it might seem, weighs nothing against the immensity of time. By cultivating this perspective, the emperor strengthened himself against provocations and found serenity where others would lose themselves in vengeance. Another fundamental aspect was the way he faced sadness. In the midst of wars and epidemics, Marcus lost companions, soldiers, and even children. Instead of surrendering to despair, he saw death as the natural order of things. Sadness was inevitable, but excessive attachment and the refusal to accept reality would be forms of rebellion against the cosmos. Emotional discipline did not erase pain, but transformed it into understanding. All belong to the same flow, and death is but a transition. This acceptance made his soul resilient in the face of losses that would have crushed the spirit of many. In today's world, Marcus Aurelius's teaching on emotional control remains vital. In an age of social pressures, instant news, and constant conflicts, it is easy to be swept away by emotional outbursts. Anger can be fueled by social media, fear multiplied by economic uncertainty, sadness intensified by comparison with the lives of others. But, as in the emperor's time, inner discipline is the key to preserving serenity. Controlling passions does not mean ignoring the world, but facing it without losing oneself in it. Thus, Marcus Aurelius left a practical and eternal legacy. Serenity does not arise from the absence of problems, but from the ability to face them with clarity and balance. The external chaos may be immense, but he who masters his passions becomes unshakable. For him, the disciplined soul is like a rock in the middle of the storm. The waves crash, the wind blows, but it remains firm, silent, and intact. This image defines what it means to live according to Stoicism, to become the master of oneself so as never to be a slave to the chaos that reigns around. Among the virtues most cultivated by Marcus Aurelius was silent discipline, the kind that does not seek applause, recognition, or fame, but is built within a man through every gesture, every choice, every controlled thought. For Stoicism, true greatness does not lie in grand speeches or spectacular deeds, but in the constancy with which one lives according to reason, even when no one is watching. Marcus Aurelius understood that ruling an empire required military strength, political astuteness, and firm decisions, but he also knew that none of this had value if he could not rule himself in silence, away from public eyes. Silent discipline was, therefore, his greatest victory, an emperor who remained faithful to the principles of virtue without needing to proclaim his own virtue to the world. In his Meditations, there are countless passages in which he reminds himself not to be carried away by pride or by the vanity of occupying the highest office in the empire. He exhorts himself to act with modesty, to speak only what is necessary, and to cultivate silence as a tool of wisdom. For Marcus, the disciplined man does not need to prove anything to others, because his strength does not depend on the opinion of others. This awareness freed him from the traps of the court, where many sought power, status, and recognition. While others surrendered to ostentation, Marcus pursued simplicity as a way of keeping his soul light. His silent discipline was also an act of resistance against the constant temptation of imperial vanity. Self-control in this sense was inseparable from silence. He who governs his tongue also governs a fundamental part of his mind. Marcus Aurelius recognized that many disputes, intrigues, and misunderstandings are born from the excess of words. For this reason, he cultivated moderation in speaking and acting. This was not a posture of weakness, but of firmness. Choosing silence when all speak is a gesture of courage. Refusing ostentation when all seek applause is an act of greatness. This form of discipline shows that true strength does not need noise, for it rests upon inner solidity. Silent discipline also manifested itself in his daily routine. Even as emperor, Marcus imposed upon himself simple habits, sleeping on modest beds during campaigns, maintaining regular work schedules, writing down his thoughts daily, avoiding excesses of luxury and of feasts. He understood that every indulgence without measure could weaken the soul, making it dependent on external pleasures. By choosing simplicity, he strengthened his spirit to face adversity. This practice was not a display of austerity, but a constant training to remain unshaken in the face of inevitable privations. This aspect of Marcus Aurelius's philosophy resonates powerfully in the modern world. We live in an age of constant exposure, where every gesture can be turned into spectacle and every achievement into a showcase for others. In this context, silent discipline becomes even rarer and more valuable. The example of the Philosopher Emperor teaches that one does not need to proclaim virtue in order to be virtuous, nor show strength in order to be strong. True greatness blossoms in the silence of daily actions, in the constancy with which one keeps the mind under control, even when there are no spectators. Reflecting on this theme, we realize that Marcus Aurelius was ahead of his time. He intuited that life is far too brief to be wasted on vanity and fleeting recognition. Silence for him was both a refuge and a refuge against the noise of the world, and a weapon against the impulses that might lead him astray from the path of virtue. His silent discipline is, therefore, an eternal lesson of humility and self-control, showing that true greatness is not displayed but lived. No philosophical teaching can stand if it cannot be lived in practice, and Marcus Aurelius is perhaps the clearest example of Stoicism applied in the midst of the chaos of real life. His reign, far from peaceful, was marked by incessant wars along the empire's frontiers, especially against the Germanic and Sarmatian tribes in the north. At the same time, he faced internal crises such as the devastating Antonine Plague, which took millions of lives and weakened Rome. These years of instability tested not only his ability as emperor, but above all his capacity to remain firm in the midst of circumstances that could have crushed any human being. It was in these contexts of war and suffering that Marcus wrote much of his meditations, transforming each external battle into a reflection of his inner struggle. During the military campaigns, Marcus Aurelius lived alongside his soldiers in makeshift camps, enduring the harsh cold, food shortages, and the constant threat of enemy attacks. He did not enjoy luxuries away from the battlefield, but shared the same difficulties with his legionaries. This posture not only strengthened the respect of his troops, but also revealed the Stoic practice of accepting fate and facing reality without escape. He did not seek comfort where there was none, but learned to find serenity in what depended on him: the disciplined mind, the unshakable soul, and the confidence that every event was part of the cosmic order. The Philosopher Emperor understood that in the midst of war, losing emotional control meant not only personal defeat, but also the ruin of thousands of lives. Anger could lead him to rash decisions, fear could paralyze his strategy, sadness could weaken his leadership. For this reason, he wrote constant reminders to himself, recalling that adversities hold no power over man, only the interpretation we give them. For Marcus, war was inevitable, but despair was optional. His mind was the true fortress where he found refuge, even when the empire was surrounded by enemies. The Antonine Plague was another great challenge that put his stoicism to the test. This devastating epidemic spread death and desolation throughout the empire, affecting both soldiers and civilians. Marcus Aurelius knew he could not control the disease or prevent its consequences, but he could control the way he reacted to it. Instead of surrendering to panic or denial, he remained active, organizing containment measures, providing assistance, and above all, reminding himself that death is an inevitable part of the natural order. This acceptance did not mean indifference, but clarity. To fight against destiny was useless. To live with dignity, even in the midst of tragedy, was the true victory. The constant presence of death on the battlefield reinforced in Marcus Aurelius the notion of life's brevity. Each fallen soldier was a reminder that existence is fragile and fleeting. Instead of falling into despair, he used this awareness to intensify his discipline, striving to live each day with justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom. There was no room to waste time on vanities or resentments, for war brutally showed that each moment could be the last. Thus the battlefield became, paradoxically, a Stoic school, a place of pain, but also of learning about the human condition. This aspect of his life demonstrates that Stoicism was not a philosophy for the comfort of silent libraries, but a survival guide amid the most intense crises. Marcus Aurelius did not philosophize to appear wise, but to maintain clarity when everything around threatened to collapse. He did not seek to win the war only with swords, but with a serene and disciplined mind, capable of making decisions without being shaken by the fury of events. It was this posture that earned him the title of Philosopher Emperor, a man who turned philosophy into living practice, even in the cruelest scenarios of existence. Among the most recurring themes in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations is the certainty that life is brief, fragile, and fleeting. This awareness of finitude did not lead him to despair, but moved him to value each moment as a gift that cannot be wasted. For the Philosopher Emperor, the brevity of existence was a call to virtue and discipline, a constant reminder that although we cannot control the length of life, we can choose the quality with which we live it. He repeated to himself that there was no time to waste on trivialities, on useless power struggles, or on the burden of grudges and vanities. Each new day was an opportunity to live according to reason, to serve the common good, and to strengthen the soul. The constant contact with death reinforced this awareness. Marcus Aurelius ruled during a time of bloody wars and epidemics that decimated entire cities. Death was not a distant abstraction, but a daily, inevitable presence that claimed soldiers, citizens, and even members of his own family. He lost children while they were still young, saw friends succumb to the plague, and witnessed the fragility of human life on the battlefield. Faced with this reality, there was no room for illusions of immortality. Life, however grand it seemed, was always a breath, and it was precisely this vision that made him determined not to waste time in vain pursuits. In his reflections, he reminded himself that all the great names of the past, no matter how powerful or famous, had already vanished. Generals, emperors, philosophers, and heroes all met the same fate: death. This final equality stripped away the deceptive shine of glory and revealed how small human concerns are when compared to eternity. The remembrance of death, far from paralyzing him, served as a stimulus to live with intensity what truly matters. Time is short, and it is precisely for that reason that it cannot be wasted on hatred, laziness, envy, or attachment to passing goods. For Marcus Aurelius, life's brevity was also an exercise in acceptance. He saw no sense in lamenting the quickness of existence, for this was the natural course of the cosmos. To fight against time would be like trying to stop the flow of a river. The wise man, therefore, must learn to flow with this course, seizing each moment to practice virtue and accepting serenely the end when it comes. In this way, death ceases to be an enemy and becomes part of the universal order. This perspective did not erase the pain of loss, but placed it in a larger frame in which each life is only one chapter of a much broader cosmic story. In the modern world, this lesson remains powerful. We live surrounded by constant distractions that make us forget the brevity of life. We lose hours in petty worries, in useless comparisons, and in the search for external validation, as if we had infinite time. Marcus Aurelius reminds us that life is far too short to be wasted in such ways. Time is the most valuable resource, and each moment that passes never returns. This awareness should not cause anguish, but rather propel us to live with focus on what truly matters, cultivating character, acting with justice, seeking serenity, and being present in every gesture. When reflecting on life's brevity, Marcus Aurelius invites us to look at the passing of time not as an enemy, but as a teacher. He teaches that the end approaches each day, and that it is for this very reason we must live in such a way that, if death were to find us now, it would find us prepared, with a serene soul faithful to virtue. The greatness of his philosophy lies in transforming the awareness of death into a source of fuller life, in transforming finitude into a call to the eternity of character. Life may be brief, but virtue makes it immense. Among the deepest teachings of Stoicism, and one that Marcus Aurelius incorporated into his Meditations, is the principle of the acceptance of destiny, known as amor fati, or love of fate. This idea stems from the conviction that the universe is governed by a rational order, the logos, and that everything that happens, no matter how painful or unexpected, is part of this great cosmic fabric. For the Stoic, to fight against the designs of nature is as useless as resisting the passage of time or trying to prevent the sun from rising. True wisdom lies in accepting destiny, not merely with resignation, but with love, understanding that each event is necessary for universal harmony. Marcus Aurelius, as both emperor and man, was constantly exposed to situations that tested this acceptance. He lost children, saw epidemics claim millions of lives, faced bloody wars, and endured the betrayal of close allies. In the face of so much suffering, it would have been easy to surrender to despair or bitterness. Yet in his writings he insists that everything that happens is already inscribed in the order of nature, and that it is the task of the wise man to accept each occurrence as part of the whole. This is not passive fatalism, but an active trust that life, with all its pains and joys, is exactly as it should be. This principle of amor fati requires mental and spiritual discipline. Marcus Aurelius knew that the human mind tends to rebel against the unexpected, asking "why me?" or wishing that events had unfolded differently. But for the Stoic, this posture is irrational. What has happened is already inevitable, and resisting it is a waste of energy. Instead, the task is to adjust the heart to reality, welcoming even adversity as an opportunity for virtue. Thus, loss becomes a lesson in detachment, pain becomes an exercise in resilience, and injustice becomes a chance to practice patience. This acceptance, however, did not mean inaction. Marcus Aurelius did not fold his arms in the face of the crises of his time. On the contrary, he worked tirelessly to protect the empire, to organize resources against the plague, to strengthen the frontiers, and to manage internal conflicts. Acceptance of destiny did not make him passive, but gave him clarity to act without despair. He understood that he could influence certain things, but that the final outcome depended on greater forces. This posture freed him from the burden of trying to control the uncontrollable and allowed him to dedicate himself to what was truly within his reach. When contemplating the cosmos, Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself of his smallness before the immensity of the universe. This awareness did not humiliate him but strengthened him. Knowing that he was only a part of a much greater order helped him put his pains and worries into perspective. In his reflections, he compares human life to a leaf carried by the wind, fragile, brief, yet still necessary for the cycle of nature. This cosmic vision gave him serenity, for it showed that his existence, with all its challenges, had meaning within the totality. In the contemporary world, this lesson remains essential. How often are we crushed by events we deem unfair or unbearable? How often do we waste energy wishing things were different? Amor fati teaches us to embrace reality not as an enemy, but as a teacher. To accept destiny with love is to transform the inevitable into an ally. It is to learn that every loss, every difficulty, and every failure is part of a greater path. Life does not mold itself to our desires, but we can mold our attitude toward life. Thus, Marcus Aurelius leaves us one of the most powerful messages of Stoicism. True freedom does not lie in choosing the events, but in choosing how we react to them. A man facing destiny can either rebel and destroy himself or accept and become invincible. To love destiny is to love life itself, with all its imperfections, and to recognize that each moment, no matter how hard it may be, is an indispensable part of the universal order. For Marcus Aurelius, as for all the Stoics, virtue was the only true good. This conviction appears repeatedly in his Meditations, where he insists that nothing external, neither wealth nor power nor fame nor pleasures, can define the value of a man. Everything that depends on external circumstances is unstable and subject to chance, but virtue, being the fruit of reason and conscious choice, remains solid and immutable. This was the foundation of his philosophy and also of his way of life. The Philosopher Emperor knew he could lose everything at any moment: the crown, his health, his children, even his own life. But virtue, as the guide of his actions, could never be taken from within him. The concept of virtue for the Stoics is divided into four fundamental pillars: justice, temperance, courage, and wisdom. These four values formed the foundation of all his decisions and his way of life. Justice, for Marcus Aurelius, was the duty to always act for the common good, placing the needs of the community above personal interests. Temperance was moderation in pleasures and desires, avoiding the excesses that enslave the soul. Courage was firmness in the face of adversity, without fleeing from pain or danger. And wisdom was the ability to discern between what is under our control and what is not, adjusting our choices to the rational order of the universe. In his notes, Marcus constantly reminded himself that glory, wealth, and power are ephemeral. How many emperors came before him, shone brightly, and then disappeared, today remembered only as names in history books. This awareness prevented him from clinging to the prestige of the imperial position. For him, being emperor was only a temporary function, a role to be played in the cosmic theater. What truly mattered was to live according to virtue, for this alone defined the eternal character of man. Power could be taken away, but integrity could never be destroyed. This focus on virtue also guided his personal and political relationships. He knew he could not control the malice or ingratitude of others, but he could control his own response. Thus, instead of retaliating with vengeance, he strove to act with justice and patience. Instead of getting lost in resentment, he sought to understand that every man acts according to his limited comprehension. Virtue, therefore, was not only a theory, but a constant practice in both public and private life. Every act of silent discipline, every gesture of humility, every difficult decision in times of war was an exercise in this philosophy. The notion that virtue is the only true good also freed Marcus Aurelius from the chains of fear. Whoever places happiness in external goods lives in constant insecurity, for they can be lost at any moment. But whoever anchors peace in virtue carries within himself an unshakable fortress. This is the essence of Stoicism, not depending on anything beyond oneself to be free and whole. For Marcus, this was the true power, the true empire, not the one conquered with armies, but the one built within the soul. In the modern world, this lesson is as necessary as it was in ancient Rome. We live surrounded by stimuli that make us believe the value of life lies in external achievements: money, success, social status, the approval of others. But all these things are fleeting and can vanish in an instant. Marcus Aurelius invites us to invert this logic, placing virtue at the center of existence. By cultivating justice, temperance, courage, and wisdom, the human being builds a life that cannot be shaken by losses or external changes. Thus, the foundation of his philosophy remains alive to this day. Virtue is the only true good, because it is the only thing that depends entirely on us. Everything else is subject to chance, but living with integrity is always within our power. This is Marcus Aurelius' deepest legacy. The certainty that true wealth is not measured in coins but in character, that true power is not found in ruling others but in ruling oneself, and that the only eternal good is that which is built within the soul. Few paradoxes in history are as fascinating as that of Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world who, in his writings, saw himself as a mere servant of reason and the universal order. Emperor of Rome, commander of legions, possessor of incalculable wealth and ruler of an empire that stretched across vast territories, he could easily have surrendered to the vanity and arrogance that destroyed so many other rulers. Yet his meditations reveal a man deeply aware of his smallness before the cosmos, someone who reminded himself daily that his position was only temporary, and that, like all mortals, he would soon dissolve into the inevitable flow of time. This contrast between power and humility was not a contradiction for Marcus, but a deliberate choice. He understood that the title of emperor was not an absolute privilege, but a fleeting function, a responsibility entrusted to him by destiny. In various reflections, he warns against the temptation of being lost in luxury and glory, recalling that even the greatest conquerors had become dust and oblivion. This awareness of mortality served as an antidote against pride. Marcus Aurelius insisted that life was far too short to be wasted on vanity, and that the true measure of a man lies in his virtue, not in his titles or external achievements. Marcus Aurelius's humility did not mean weakness. On the contrary, it was a sign of strength and clarity. He knew that power easily corrupts those who let themselves be dominated by desires of personal grandeur. That is why he constantly sought to remind himself that his mission was to serve, not to dominate. The empire he governed was not his by absolute right, but a duty that demanded discipline, justice, and temperance. His power only had meaning if it was guided by reason and the pursuit of the common good. This posture distinguished him from tyrants and despots who used their office to satisfy their ambitions. Marcus, on the contrary, saw power as an opportunity to practice virtue on a larger scale. A clear example of this vision can be found in his life at the imperial court. Surrounded by flatterers, sycophants, and enemies disguised as allies, he constantly reminded himself not to let praise corrupt him or criticism destroy him. His humility was the weapon that protected him from these extremes. The Philosopher Emperor recognized that his soul needed to remain balanced, indifferent to flattery and offense alike, focused only on what was under his control, his rational conduct. Thus, even surrounded by absolute power, he sought to act as a common man, aware that in the end everyone shares the same fate. Another fundamental point was his perception that no matter how vast the Roman Empire might be, it was still nothing more than a particle compared to the immensity of the universe. Marcus Aurelius contemplated the cosmos and perceived that his earthly power was insignificant when set against the eternal order of the stars and the Logos. This cosmic perspective reinforced his humility and gave him serenity in the face of life's transience. What truly mattered was not Rome's glory, but the ability to live in harmony with universal reason. For him, the true sovereign was not the man crowned with laurels, but the one who remained faithful to virtue and duty. In the modern world, this combination of power and humility remains one of Marcus Aurelius's most valuable lessons. We live in an age where success and status often become reasons for excessive pride and corrosive vanity. But the example of the Philosopher Emperor shows that true greatness does not lie in ruling multitudes, but in ruling oneself. The man who governs with humility is more powerful than the one who loses himself in arrogance, because his strength does not depend on others' opinions, but on the firmness of his soul. Marcus Aurelius left us the example that it is possible to be at the height of power, without losing the awareness that we are all temporary beings. His humility, in contrast with the grandeur of Rome, is an eternal reminder. The throne may be high, but destiny is the same for everyone. And it is precisely in this recognition of human fragility that true greatness resides, the greatness of living as a servant of reason, not as a slave of vanity. Few men have known pain and suffering in so many forms as Marcus Aurelius. During his reign, he endured the loss of children in early childhood, faced devastating epidemics such as the Antonine Plague, watched soldiers and civilians perish in great numbers, and lived constantly surrounded by wars that demanded cruel decisions. In addition, his own health was fragile. He suffered from recurring illnesses that weakened him physically and emotionally. Yet, instead of surrendering to bitterness or despair, he chose to transform pain into a teacher and suffering into a school of virtue. For Marcus, adversity was not an obstacle to Stoicism, but the fertile ground where philosophy revealed its true strength. In his meditations, the emperor continuously reminded himself that suffering is inevitable, but that its interpretation and our reaction to it depend exclusively on us. Physical pain may be intense, but it has no power to corrupt the soul that remains steadfast. Losses may be devastating, but they cannot destroy the mind that accepts the universal order. This distinction between what happens outside and what happens inside was his greatest weapon. He understood that he could not avoid external tragedies, but he could prevent them from stealing his serenity. Thus, every blow of life became an opportunity to exercise resilience and strengthen his inner discipline. Stoic philosophy taught that pain should not be a reason for revolt, but for learning. Marcus Aurelius applied this principle by remembering that even adversities are part of nature. To resist them would be to resist the very course of the cosmos. Therefore, he sought to embrace suffering as part of the rational order, not as punishment, but as opportunity. The loss of a child, for example, was not only a personal tragedy, but also a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of not clinging to goods that are not under our control. Illness, no matter how debilitating, was an occasion to practice patience and courage. Even bodily pain could be endured if the mind remained firm in its mission to live according to virtue. This posture towards suffering did not make him cold, but profound. Marcus Aurelius did not deny pain, but looked it straight in the eye and integrated it into his journey. Instead of fleeing from it or numbing himself in fleeting pleasures, he used it as fuel to strengthen the soul. This is one of the most inspiring aspects of his philosophy, the ability to see in suffering not only a burden, but an opportunity for growth. He saw adversity as the fire that tests the solidity of metal. The more intense the flame, the stronger becomes the one who passes through it with courage. In the modern world, this lesson has enormous relevance. We live in a society that often seeks to avoid pain at any cost, whether through distractions, excess, or denial. But as Marcus Aurelius teaches us, suffering is part of life and resisting it only increases anguish. The Stoic path is that of active acceptance, to embrace pain as an inevitable part of existence and transform it into an opportunity for growth. Resilience in this sense is not just to endure, but to grow from what wounds us. The strength of Marcus Aurelius did not lie in escaping adversity, but in facing it with dignity. This is the essence of Stoic resilience. Pain does not define who we are, but how we react to it does. Suffering does not have to crush us. It can shape us. This lesson, written in silence in a soldier's camp journal, still echoes today as a call to courage. Accept pain, learn from it, and emerge stronger. In this transmutation lies the true victory of the human soul. For Marcus Aurelius, true freedom was not a political or social matter, but an inner conquest. Even though he was the emperor of Rome, the most powerful man of his time, he knew that his external authority meant nothing if his soul was chained to passions, fear, vanity, or the desire for approval. Stoic philosophy teaches that all men, regardless of their condition, can be free or enslaved depending solely on how they handle their mind and desires. A slave who masters his soul can be freer than an emperor dominated by his emotions. This radical inversion is one of the greatest treasures of Stoic thought, and Marcus Aurelius lived it intensely. In his meditations, he constantly reminded himself that nothing external could imprison the truly wise man. Illness could weaken the body, but it could not touch the soul. Loss could bring sorrow, but it could not destroy inner serenity. Death could end existence, but it could not annul the dignity with which life had been lived. Freedom lay in choosing how to respond, in maintaining control over one's perceptions, in not allowing the external world to dictate the value of life. Thus, Marcus Aurelius saw himself as dwelling within an inner fortress, impenetrable to pressures, insults, and misfortunes. This notion of inner freedom was not merely theoretical. Marcus lived amid profound crises, surrounded by wars, epidemics, and political betrayals. He could not control most of what happened around him, but he could control his response to those events. This distinction, inherited from Epictetus, was central to his philosophical practice. Some things are within our power, others are not. Freedom consists in devoting oneself only to what is under our control, our attitudes, thoughts, and decisions, and accepting with serenity everything that lies beyond it. This mental clarity freed Marcus from unnecessary anxieties and allowed him to act with rationality, even in the midst of chaos. The paradox is evident. An absolute emperor, who at the same time recognized that his political power was limited. He could order the movement of legions, but could not command death to be abolished. He could issue decrees, but could not change the nature of life. He could govern men, but could not control destiny. This awareness of limits is what made him truly free, for it freed him from the illusion of absolute control. He accepted that his sovereignty over the world was relative, but his sovereignty over himself could be total. In the contemporary world, Marcus Aurelius's lesson on inner freedom has striking relevance. We live in an age in which many confuse freedom with consumer power, with the absence of rules, or with the ability to satisfy desires without restraint. But the result of that pursuit is often the opposite. People enslaved by anxiety, by constant comparison, by the incessant craving for recognition, and by dependence on external goods. The Philosopher Emperor reminds us that true freedom is not conquered outside but within. To be free is not to depend on applause, not to be dragged by fear, not to be hostage to pleasure or resentment. Thus, Marcus Aurelius shows us that inner freedom is the only one no one can take away. Neither loss, nor illness, nor injustice, nor even death has power over the soul that remains faithful to reason and virtue. This is the freedom that endures when all others are gone. It is the freedom that sustains man in the face of the worst circumstances. It is the freedom that transforms life into victory, even when the external world appears to be defeat. If Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations only for himself, never imagining they would be read centuries later, the impact they exert today is proof that true wisdom transcends time and adapts to the needs of each generation. In the 21st century, in a world saturated with information, marked by collective anxiety, by the excess of digital stimuli and the constant pursuit of recognition, the words of the Philosopher Emperor have taken on new life. Short, dense, and direct phrases, born in military camps or silent nights of reflection, now circulate through social networks like modern mantras for millions of people seeking serenity. The fascination with Stoic philosophy in the present is directly linked to its practicality. Unlike complex and abstract philosophical systems, Stoicism speaks to daily life with clarity and urgency. It teaches how to deal with loss, with frustration, with anger, with fear, and with the inevitability of death. In a society where many feel at the mercy of global crises, political instability, economic pressures, and constant comparisons on social media, the principles of Marcus Aurelius offer a clear compass. Focus only on what depends on you, accept what is beyond your control, and live according to virtue. This powerful simplicity is what makes it so contemporary. Furthermore, the digital era has brought a new form of noise against which Marcus Aurelius already warned in his time: distractions. Today, these distractions are not merely feasts or spectacles, but incessant notifications, endless streams of images and opinions, and the pressure to respond to every stimulus. In this environment, the silent discipline he advocated becomes even more necessary. His counsel to cultivate moments of introspection, to write for oneself, to practice moderation, and to keep the mind centered is a direct response to contemporary anxiety. His voice resonates like that of a master who seems to speak not only to his own age but directly to ours. Another point that explains the relevance of Marcus Aurelius today is the existential emptiness that many experience in societies increasingly fast and superficial. The relentless pursuit of immediate pleasure, rapid success, and external validation breeds frustration and anguish. In this context, the reminder that happiness is not found in external goods, but in the cultivation of virtue, serves as an antidote to superficiality. His words provide depth amidst overstimulation, silence amidst noise, and meaning amidst haste. This is why so many young people and adults now turn to Stoic maxims as guides for a more balanced life. Social networks, in turn, have transformed these ideas into an accessible language. Small excerpts from the Meditations circulate as reminders of wisdom. The happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. Accept what fate brings. You have power over your mind, not over external events. These maxims, condensed into short sentences, fit perfectly into the digital format, while carrying centuries of depth. What was once a private diary has now become a public source of motivation and reflection, read on cell phones by people who may never have opened a philosophical treatise, but who find their comfort and direction. However, the true value of Marcus Aurelius's words does not lie merely in their digital virality, but in their ability to transform lives. Many find in his reflections support against anxiety, guidance to cope with losses, or a silent strength in the face of adversity. His philosophy demonstrates that, even in a world dominated by haste and uncertainty, it is still possible to build an inner fortress. The emperor who wrote for himself ended up writing for all time, and his echo in the digital age is proof that truth does not grow old. Marcus Aurelius remains alive because his message is universal. It does not matter the era, the culture, or the technology, the human condition remains the same. We continue to suffer, to lose, to fear, and to seek meaning. And we continue to need reminders that what truly matters is not how much we have, but how we live, not how long our life lasts, but how much virtue we are capable of placing in it. Thus, the Philosopher Emperor became, unintentionally, one of the greatest influences of the digital age, not because he sought followers, but because he sought truth. The legacy of Marcus Aurelius transcends the boundaries of ancient Rome and reaches us as an inexhaustible source of practical wisdom, capable of guiding men and women in any time or circumstance. If in his age he had to face brutal wars, devastating epidemics, and political crises, today we face social pressures, emotional anxieties, economic uncertainties, and an avalanche of stimuli that daily test our serenity. The philosophy he lived and recorded in silence has not aged. It remains a map of emotional survival, a compass to navigate chaos without losing clarity. The Philosopher Emperor became an eternal guide because he showed, through his own life, that there is no greater strength than that which is born from mastery of the mind and inner discipline. The Meditations, written without any intention of publication, ended up becoming one of the most influential books in history, read by leaders, scholars, artists, and ordinary people. This is one of the great paradoxes of his legacy. A personal diary, meant to remind him of his own weaknesses and duties, is now seen as a manual of emotional strength. What was meant to remain private became a treasure of humanity. This only reinforces the authenticity of Marcus Aurelius. He did not write to impress, but to survive spiritually. It is precisely this honesty that gives his work its universal power. His legacy also demonstrates that power does not have to corrupt, that it is possible to stand at the height of command and still live with humility and a sense of service. In a world where leaders often lose themselves in vanity and abuse, Marcus Aurelius is remembered as an example of balance between power and ethics. He taught us that to govern is not to dominate, but to serve, that to lead is not to pursue personal glory, but to preserve the common good. His life became a testimony that philosophy is not only for scholars, but for anyone who wishes to live with dignity, regardless of the position they hold. Another fundamental aspect of his legacy is the notion that true freedom and true strength come from within. In a time like ours, marked by dependency on external validation and by overwhelming distractions, this lesson is urgent. Marcus Aurelius showed that nothing can harm the man who preserves the serenity of his mind, who accepts fate with courage, and who places virtue above all. He invites us to look less at what we cannot control, and more at what depends on us, our attitudes, our thoughts, our daily choices. This shift of focus is transformative and remains the heart of his teaching. Resilience in the face of pain, the acceptance of life's brevity, love of fate, the cultivation of silent discipline, and the conviction that virtue is the only true good. All of these principles echo as permanent lessons for humanity. Marcus Aurelius reminds us that no matter how much technology advances, the human condition does not change in its essence. We will continue to face losses, suffering, and uncertainty, but we will also continue to carry within us the capacity to endure all of it with firmness and serenity. His voice crosses the centuries to remind us that we do not need to be emperors to live like philosophers, and that wisdom is available to anyone who chooses to cultivate the mind as their greatest fortress. Thus, the Stoic legacy of Marcus Aurelius is more than historical. It is existential. He offers us a path to face life with courage, simplicity, and serenity. In a world of constant noise, his message remains clear. Greatness is not about conquering crowds or accumulating wealth, but about conquering oneself. That is why Marcus Aurelius is remembered not only as the Emperor of Rome, but as a guide of emotional strength for all humanity, someone whose life and words became a beacon to illuminate the passage of time.